Good afternoon and welcome to AP European History with Mr. Bowlby. Today we'll be discussing Chapter 23, Section 4 of the McKay, Hill, and Buckler text, 7th edition. And this is Chapter 23, Ideologies and Upheavals. And we will be dealing with, in this slide cast, reforms and revolutions. And these are the reforms and revolutions that happened before the 1848 reforms. First of all, we need to note that as Metternich and others in the Holy Alliance are trying to make sure that liberalism and radical nationalism do not run rampant in revolution throughout the continent of Europe, there are a few places where it breaks free. In Spain and the Two Sicilies, they are successful at combating this revolution. However, the first to really break free is Greece. Okay, after failures in Italy and Spain, the Greeks are the first to successfully revolt. Now, led by a man named Ypsilanti in 1821. They fight for freedom from the Ottoman Turks. He's a pretty interesting character. He lost an arm during the Napoleonic Wars. He's a very popular figure at the Congress of Vienna, and he's actually a Russian national who was elected by the Greeks. The great powers try to oppose the Greek uprising, specifically Austria and Prussia. However, the Greek story and really the vast Greek history is romanticized by the people, and countries like Britain, France, and Russia end up supporting the nationalists, and Greece gains their independence in 1830 as a success story in combating conservatism in continental Europe. The next part of this section talks about Great Britain, and Great Britain does actually have a lot of liberal reforms that take place. The thing that's most important to note about Great Britain, however, is that these reforms come primarily through peaceful means, and that's very, very significant. And they come slowly and stably, and that's been the course that Great Britain has been taking in the past couple of chapters, if you'll note in your text. And it's done Great Britain well to be rational with these tides. Okay, Great Britain was pretty stable, but there was an undercurrent of reform. Only about 8% of the population could still vote. The aristocracy controlled the Tory party, and they really feared this liberalism working within. And they worked really, really hard to repress that. And the greatest example of that work to repress that are the Corn Laws of 1815. These are incredibly selfish and divisive laws that are only meant to help a very, very small portion of the people. What they did is they stopped the importation of grain unless the price rose above a certain very, very high level. This kept the wages of the working class and the lower classes very much in check among the people. And it protected only the interests of a very few, and was able to kind of help keep repressing people so they couldn't do a lot about it. This prompted urban labor and intellectuals to protest, and this battle will kind of go back and forth for years now. The Tory government suspended peaceable assembly and habeas corpus, and eventually mass meetings in the Six Acts of 1819. So they really go out of their way here uncharacteristically to take away some rights that had been granted to the people, some rights that had been put in many constitutions and have been argued about by many over and over as steps moving forward. The cavalry savagely break up any protests over these acts. That's known and referred to in your text as the Battle of Peterloo, and Peterloo is referring to Waterloo, almost in a snarky context. And they broke up these protests, and it just goes to show, the Battle of Peterloo goes to show just how far the Tory government would go to repress these ideas that the working class is getting about revolution. The Whig Party comes into play here. They're still very aristocratic, but they are much more willing to listen to the demands of the people. And the demands of the people at this point are more rights for Catholics, reform of town governments, reorganization of the police force, and reform of the poor laws, or aid for low-paid workers at this point. And that's going to come into play in this the constant historical battle now that we'll watch in Great Britain between the Tories and the Whigs. The Reform Bill of 1832 brings some of these demands to fruition. The House of Commons emerged as a major legislative body. The industrial areas gained representation, and the rotten boroughs, so the boroughs that had almost nobody living in them, but the Tory party still used and would place a representative there so that they would have more representatives in Parliament, were eliminated. Okay, and districts were reorganized. The Chartists at this time are still demanding universal male suffrage, and there is becoming a growing and more overwhelming amount of Chartists in the population. They demand this universal male suffrage, however, they fail repeatedly, time after time. While they are unsuccessful in their demand for universal male suffrage, the Anti-Corn Law League is successful finally in repealing the Corn Laws in 1846. Free trade is established. But at the cost of high tariffs, which is still much better than the corn laws that were in place. And of note here is Robert Peel, the Tory Prime Minister, who finally gives in and concedes a little bit, which shows that they're moving towards definitely a more liberal society. The 10-Hour Act is passed in 1847, limiting factory workday for women and young people. And all of these things lead to fairly peaceful revolution and reform in Great Britain. Of note also in this section of the text, Ireland and the Great Famine. Ireland at this point is still controlled by the English Protestants, English Protestant landlords, who control the Catholic peasants, farmers. There is a shocking poverty and tremendous population growth. The population growth is due to the cultivation of potatoes. It's said that the average male in Ireland lived off of approximately 10 pounds of potatoes a day. Okay, potato farmers, early marriage, all had to do with this increase in population that was happening, even though Ireland was a fairly poor and unstable country. Greedy landlords controlled the masses, and they did this a lot of times with high rent that they would charge, and they would continue to charge through the Great Famine. So you've got this makeup of very unstable population. And what happens when the potato crop becomes much more sporadic from 1820 on, and really the crop fails, specifically in 45, 46, and 48 to 51, you have the Great Famine. And this Great Famine, or the reason they mention the Great Famine in this part of the text, is because it's going to point us towards two things. It's going to point us toward a great migration of people, which affects many, many places in Europe and beyond, including the Americas. And it's going to promote eventual Irish nationalism, which is going to be very significant in the upcoming chapters. But there was just inadequate relief, continued greed and government pressure, and then on top of that, crop failure that led to millions dying, and the great Irish migration or diaspora across the globe. Finally, this section of your text talks about France and Revolution of 1830 in France, not to be confused with Revolution of 1848. The irony of the Revolution of 1830 in France is that really by the end of the revolution, the revolutionaries feel like nothing has changed. In fact, the restrictions and regulations on them have perhaps tightened, although not been as bad or repressive as they were prior to 1789. Louis XVIII is instated. He's not given very much credit in your text or by most historians. In 1814, he survives the 100-day return of Napoleon, and then returns again and will live out his days as the monarch of France. He establishes a constitutional charter of 1814, and although this is anything but democratic, very few people can vote. Approximately only about 100,000 of the wealthiest males of a 30 million person population. It does protect the people against the return of absolutism, of royal absolutism. Louis dies in 1824 and gives way to his brother Charles X, who desperately tries to rally French support through nationalism. He even does this through the guise of a war in Algeria. Um, and he tries to reestablish the old order. That's really what he's doing. He does this in a rather coy manner, but by 1830, he's had enough. He repudiates the constitutional charter and fails miserably at a coup attempt to take over. Um, he fails and he flees the country, which leads the way to his cousin, who was a much more common man in the eyes of the aristocracy, and was a people that it was a person that the revolutionaries sought out to be the next leader, Louis Philippe. He takes the reins. He accepts the Charter of 1814, but really does little more than to protect the rich upper middle class, which really gets France right back to where they started. So the Revolution of 1830, if we have to characterize it, is a revolution that does not do a lot to help all of the people of France. They are still waiting for this to happen.